Do you remember the last time Mazda launched an all-new vehicle in the Philippines? Well, aside from the BT50 in 2020, there hasn't really been much new in the car and crossover realm, except maybe for facelifts and upgrades. But Mazda's always been like that. The MX-5 is already 8 years old, the CX-5 is now 6, and if you count the first time Kodo came out, that would be 11. But I guess if you build something right the first time, why fix it? It's just that in car years, this long a wait is just too long. And that's why we have this, an all-new product, an all-new offering, and an all-new nameplate. This is the all-new Mazda CX-60. Special thanks, of course, to Grand Motors, the distributors of Mazda in Brunei, for letting us drive the Mazda CX-60. Now, you might be wondering if this is the logical successor to the Mazda CX-5, and we won't judge you for thinking that. It is a 5-seater like the CX-5, albeit larger in almost every dimension. The CX-60 is longer by 190mm, wider by 48mm, but sits just a hair taller than the CX-5 at 1687.5mm. So we get it if you think it's just a heftier CX-5. However, despite the bigger dimensions, the CX-60 actually sits 9mm lower to the ground than the CX-5. Like the CX-5, the CX-60 also has LED headlamps and tail lamps. Interestingly though, it has adopted the Mazda 3 and the CX-30's heartbeat signal lights. And from the side, you will notice it handles reflections of light in its surroundings similar to both vehicles too, with no obvious creases and belt lines. Only the subtle curves of the metal showing off the shape of the Mazda CX-60. Also, the CX-60 gets bigger wheels. This all-wheel drive variant wears 20 inches all around, a step up from the CX-5's 19s. It also has these neat rectangular exhaust tips, much like a Porsche Cayenne, don't you think? Now, if you think that's the only difference between the Mazda CX-60 and the CX-5, you're in for a big surprise because the Mazda CX-60 comes with double wishbone front suspensions and multi-link to the rear. That's opposed to the McPherson's that the CX-5 had. And it also has 328mm of braking rotor sizes, so it's different from the CX-5's 303mm. And that's because the CX-60 weighs 1,815 kilos. That's about 106 kilos more than the CX-5. And you have to remember that this is a new large body platform that it shares with the Mazda CX-90. And that means it is a rear-wheel drive platform. So the engine is longitudinally mounted, that means front to back. And then there's a propeller shaft underneath and it drives the rear wheels. So this Skyactiv all-wheel drive system is rear bias. It means the rear wheels are pushing the car and then it only activates the front once there's traction lost. Despite the layout, the CX-60 does boast of a larger wheelbase than the CX-5, about 17mm more in fact. And this translates to more legroom and a wider cabin space as well. But it's inside where Mazda really went to town. Now, the freshly redesigned interiors do remind you of the Mazda CX-5. However, it's in the materials that they chose for the Mazda CX-60 where the difference lies. Now, soft to the touch interiors like here on the dash and on the door cards, along with the leather seats, make it appear more premium and smoother than what the CX-5 offered before. You got interesting patterns going on around here. Look at these designs on the doors and in the center console, and even the stitching on the seats. And it now has a panoramic sunroof. Surprise, surprise for Mazda. But to keep the chassis rigid, it still maintained this beam in the middle so that you can continue to have little flex in the chassis. Fortunately too, Mazda stuck around with its driver-focused philosophy by keeping these buttons intact, making sure that the primary functions of the car, including air conditioning and the seat warming and seat cooling, are all done by buttons and not through the touchscreen. And that's why we still have a Mazda Connect controller right here. The knob is here to control all the functions that you can see on the 12.3-inch Mazda Connect display. Unfortunately, we still don't have a touchscreen service. This CX-60 comes with a 12-speaker Bose sound system, complete with a spare tire subwoofer at the back. So the sound feels punchy and deep, as you would expect from a premium ride of this size. And more fascination with the number 12, as we see the main instrument display become an all-digital affair now, with snazzy opening graphics and color-coded displays depending on the drive mode you select in the M-Drive system. However, unlike most China brands now, you can't really change the theme of this display. You're stuck with this layout, give or take a function or two, and that's it. But you still get a heads-up display at least, and that one is laid out more clearly too to complement your driving. Now you're probably wondering how the Mazda CX-60 rides and handles. Well, let's take it out for a spin. Now, just a bit of a disclaimer, this particular variant of the Mazda CX-60 is not exactly what's going to come out in the Philippines. For starters, this is right-hand drive, and we're trying our best to give a first drive impression of the Mazda CX-60 without actually being offered one. Now, this particular CX-60 model comes with a 2.5-liter Skyactiv G engine with 191 PS and 265 Newton meters of torque. Sounds familiar. We do know that the Inline-six is coming because that's what Mazda Philippines already publicly announced. And it will be a turbocharged 3.3-liter with about 284 PS and 450 Newton meters of torque. So that should just fit about the right size of this car and the needs of this heavier CX-60. And since we've already had a mild hybrid CX-30 and Mazda 3, what's going to stop Mazda Philippines from adding that into the mix as well? Mazda's new M-Hybrid Boost now has a 48-volt system, a step up from the previous 24 volts the other two models have. But we have reason to believe that Mazda will still be bringing in the 3.3-liter inline-six in both gas and diesel versions. And that reason is JEPEPA. So the Japan-Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement, or JEPEPA, has a provision that states that any car from Japan with a 3.0-liter and above displacement gets zero import duties. Now, that gives it a price advantage over the European marques. Now, along with the top-of-the-line specs will come top-of-the-line interiors. So, Mazda Philippines will likely bring in all the tan combinations of the Mazda CX-60 to give it that more premium and luxurious feel. Even the steering wheel will be a tan two-tone version that's similar to a Bentley. Matched with brushed metal panels where the piano black surfaces were, actually gives a bit more of a high-end feel inside the cabin. And of course, the Mazda CX-60 will come with an iActive Sense suite, and that includes improvements on the Mazda radar cruise control. Is now iAdaptive radar cruise control, and of course, you also have a 360 high-resolution camera going on with probably a see-through function. Now, in terms of driving dynamics, it's a little bit unfair to compare a 2.5-liter engine NA engine with the inline-six. But in terms of ride quality, with the right tire pressures, you do get a little bit more comfort, a little bit more play compared to the CX-5, which at times could be choppy on undulating roads. But here with the Mazda CX-60, it's smoother. The movements between the ups and the downs, the compressions and the rebounds of the suspension are a little bit more tamer and more controlled. It's not all over the place and definitely not harsh at all. Now let me just give you a quick impression of the driving feel of the Mazda CX-60. Despite the smaller engine displacement that we have, it's not an inline-six, you do feel a bit more premium inside. It's quieter, the seats are firmer, just to support that S-curve that Mazda wants to perpetuate into the driving consciousness of their customers. And like typical Mazda, the steering wheel is a little bit weighted, which is good. It gives you a sense of how big the vehicle you're driving is. Now for the pedals, the accelerator is still the organ type. However, the brakes, they feel a bit stiff. The pedal travel isn't too deep compared to other cars that you're probably used to. Probably takes a little bit more bedding in. We've only done about 600 kilometers in this car. Having said that, the brakes do still feel positive. It gives you good confidence when you're driving and you're slowing down. Now, in typical Mazda fashion, whatever input you do give into the steering and into the pedals translates instantly to a reaction from the car. And that's good because it lets you communicate with the car. I mean, we've been saying this all along ever since, but there hasn't really been a mass market brand that has approximated the driving level and finesse of the European brands, you know? Mazda is almost there. It's just very, very close. You can hardly discern whether you're driving a European car or a Japanese car. And that's how good Mazda has made the driving dynamics of their cars have. And that includes the Mazda CX-60. Now, in terms of equipment, build quality, and the choice of materials inside, everything seems prim and proper in the Mazda CX-60. All of these little things are making the Mazda CX-60 a little bit more pricey, but at the same time, it does give you a little bit more distinction from the normal mass market brands like the Toyotas, the Mitsubishis, and all that. It gets you closer to Lexus levels, actually. And in the driving dynamics department, I'm sure it's not so far away from a BMW. Now, like most popular European brands like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Jaguar, they all use rear-wheel drive bias now. And then that's kind of the strategy that Mazda has been after. Is really going after the European marks to make sure that they can eke out the maximum profits for the limited volume that they are able to produce. So that's the kind of the strategy where premium is involved. Now you can charge a bit more and keep your costs down by elevating the brand stature. But by maximizing the profits of each model sold, that's one way to balance the books. Now, only time will tell, of course, if this premium strategy movement of Mazda will pay off. In an automotive world where EVs are making headway, Mazda is a little bit behind, so it needs to catch up with some form of carbon reduction, whether it's using sustainable fuels as the original strategy was, or making use of more battery electric vehicles in the future, but that's a few years away. And meanwhile, the Chinese brands, of course, will continue to develop their new energy vehicles and probably gain a bigger head start while Mazda is still trying to figure out how to do that. However, if you're in the market for a premium ride without necessarily wanting to spend as much for a house, then probably you might want to consider a Mazda CX-60, especially in the trim that they'll be having in the Philippines. The Inline-six, whether it's a gasoline or a diesel, should prove to be a very potent combination with this size of car. Heck, all these features and specs might even make you want to forget about the CX-5, the CX-8, and the CX-9, and we can't blame you. Now let's be clear, we still don't know the price yet of the Mazda CX-60 in Philippine trim. However, with JPEPA coming in, as we mentioned earlier, that could mean about a price point of about sub 3 million if we're lucky. Now, are all these design, mechanical, and experiential changes enough for the Mazda CX-60 to do battle with the Audis, BMWs, and Mercedes out there? Well, you have to catch our review on AutoFun Philippines. Do make sure to follow us on our social media channels on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And keep an eye on this. The Mazda CX-60 is about to launch anytime now.